Hello, and welcome to AWS Review, a weekly look at what's happening at AWS and how it may change how you do business. I'm your host, Michael Krause. I am the Chief Technology Officer at Charter Solutions, where we help organizations change and innovate quickly by accelerating their acquisition and use of data.
And I'm your co-host, John Affolter. I'm a lead technical architect on the AWS specialist team at Salesforce, where I work with potential customers, help them envision the possibilities that Salesforce and AWS enable.
Well, John, welcome back for another episode.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm excited to be here, and I know that you're in a different environment here today, but here in Minnesota, it's nice and rainy. So, um,
Yeah, and I heard it's going to be like 94 degrees tomorrow.
yeah,
Don't
90, yeah, like 97, I think, at some point this week, and yeah, I guess summer's be careful what you wish for, I guess. So
Exactly. And for those people who are joining us, if you have noticed the fact that I'm in a little bit different room, I'm in a hotel today. I'm out traveling, but we're making the show happen no matter what.
yeah, at all costs. So Michael, I wanted to take some time to I'm a big thrifter, so wanted to take some time to talk about some of my recent thrifting scores here. I have a nice
Excellent.
little lighthouse candle holder here that I got that I'm pretty excited about, and
Oh, that's cool.
got some good party shorts here. Life is short. These are pretty good. And then
Life is short. Enjoy it while you can.
yeah, right. And then I was really excited about this, because I'm a hockey player and I won't break out my teeth right now, but John Dangle here. I thought this was a pretty good one too. So
Oh, very nice.
yes,
Very nice. I was going to
awesome.
say, I think you can claim the title that my somebody once gave my wife, which is, urban beachcomber.
Yeah, absolutely. No,
And
I'll
my
take.
Yeah,
But
my
yeah,
wife's a big thrifter as well, and she finds some amazing stuff.
yeah, I think I have a sixth sense. I can look down the row and I feel when there's a good thing. Oh yeah, and this shirt right here. This is also a
The Shelby shirt,
yeah,
yes,
the Shelby
excellent.
shirt. Yeah, I thought that was a pretty good score too. So yeah, before we move on to the topic for the day, which is transforming and curating data for analytics on AWS, let's take a little look at what's been happening at AWS.
Sure, it's oftentimes a lot of things we talk about revolve around application development and analytics, but not a lot of noise in that space today. But there are some interesting things that people should be aware of. So, AWS has launched the AWS Mainframe Modernization Service. So if you've got mainframe applications and you want to get them out into AWS, this is a service that provides tools and resources to help you plan and implement that migration. Additionally, I always love to read the EC2 updates because, I remember building computers for work and, so amazed that, we could get like a 10 gigabyte hard drive into this thing, right?
Hmm.
And now Amazon's kind of released some new R6 instances, the R6 ID instances, with local NVMe storage, up to 7.6 terabytes of local storage, SSD storage on these things.
Jeez.
It's some of the stats they're talking about: 15% increase in price performance, 33% more vCPU, up to a terabyte of memory, 2x networking performance, 2x EBS performance, global availability. And I always have to go look at the biggest one because those always intrigue me. So the largest instance they have in this group is the R6 ID 32x large, 128 virtual CPUs, a gig or a terabyte of RAM. I
Jeez.
want this as a gaming machine, right?
Yeah,
Uh,
right.
four 1.9 terabyte SSDs, 40 gigabyte per second or gigabit per second EBS, so elastic block store throughput for shared hard drives, and 50 gigabit per second network throughput on this thing.
That's,
Uh,
that's
so
just insanity.
I want to spin it up and run something on it just for fun, right?
Yeah, I might have to. Yeah, it might have to take a loan out for that one. I would assume.
We'll make it a really fast job because I think they're charging by the second on these now.
Oh yeah, jeez. Yeah, no, and I wanted to this isn't necessarily an AWS feature update, but they just came, or they were introducing a new white paper. It was done by Emily Wu at the Harvard University's Belfer Center. So
Okay.
the paper is, does data localization cause more problems than it solves? And so it's really looking at, all right, are we really doing things that are improving privacy, improving security? And it really takes an interesting look at kind of, is it even worth it? So I know you've dealt with data localization here before, Michael, and
Yeah, and
what are your thoughts without kind of diving into the white paper, I guess?
yeah, so I think, I've asked that same question myself. You know, definitely there's a need to protect privacy and have policy that does that. Data localization is a policy thing, so it's not going to change quickly because different, you know, geopolitical um, scenarios are going to be there no matter what. The trick is getting to a point where you can create a, what I'll say, an infrastructure of privacy that's global.
Mm-hmm.
If AWS can bring something to the table that says, hey, as long as the customers are using this, we can guarantee privacy. Similar to the concept of a BAA under HIPAA, right? The
Yeah.
business associate agreement. If they can bring something to the table that can do that, then it creates an opportunity to open the door for those policymakers to say, you need to follow these rules unless you're doing something like this, in which case the localization isn't as critical because we've got certain guarantees of privacy and data protection.
Yeah, I think it's just really about, building an infrastructure to where you can just get ahead of it and, kind of, to your point, all the time, just stay adaptable and be able to
Yeah.
act on it when it comes. And
Yeah.
I guess, another interesting privacy type update, and this is not directly AWS, but I'm sure people have MongoDB in their AWS environments. But MongoDB just released in preview to be able to query data that's still encrypted. So pretty interesting concept, and I wonder when AWS might introduce something like this as well.
Yeah, especially with their kind of MongoDB compliant solution,
Yep.
Document DB. But it's also got an interesting tie into the white paper that you mentioned, because I think you know there's a pendulum swing that always happens in these
Mhm.
things, right? People abuse something, then people react, and on the other side, they try to lock it down, and then that it becomes too locked down, and then the pendulum
Mhm.
swings back. Eventually, it finds a center that is acceptable to all parties. But that's where we're at right now. And as more infrastructure comes into play that provides a guarantee of sorts around protection, we're going to have better policy around better political policies around this protection. We're going to have better corporate policies around this protection. Things are going to be easier to implement. Um, so it's an interesting space, but there's mistakes all over, right? If you've seen the news on the M1 chip
Oh yeah.
and exploits of the M1, the hardware on the M1 chip, and that just proves to you that no, even when you try to put some of your protections at the lowest level, there's always opportunities for holes to occur. So it's
Yep.
it's going to be interesting to watch,
Yeah,
definitely.
especially when quantum starts getting into it, and that'll add a whole nother element of level of encryption, both from hardening standpoint, but also you can break in a lot easier too at the same time. So it'll be an interesting dynamic when that comes through.
Yeah. That's I mean, it would be fun to do a whole speculative conversation on quantum stuff. I was just chatting with somebody last week with one of our clients that around um, highly consistent, globally distributed databases,
Hmm.
and the fact that our problem is our network.
Yeah,
Latency on our network is our biggest problem in that space, right? And
you can't stop it.
no. But as soon as we are able to eliminate the latency cost of network travel, you know, a la quantum pairs, right?
Mhm.
or something along those lines, suddenly being able to replicate globally a database becomes very fast, and it becomes the standard now, right? Why would you ever have a local database when you can have one replicated globally? Um, so but it'll be interesting to see where a lot of that goes too. So that's a bit off topic, but
Yeah.
I think that from a futurist perspective, that will tie into the conversation a little bit today, because we're talking about
Hmm.
processing data, and in a lot of situations, processing lots of data,
Yep.
and how Amazon, kind of helps that out. So today, our topic is transforming and curating data for analytics on AWS. This is going to be a very broad conversation because there are a lot of tools on
Hmm.
AWS that can be used for this. And our hope today is that we will, you know, introduce you to some tools you may not be familiar with or may have only heard about a little bit, that we might be able to give you some ideas and thoughts around how to plan out your curation mechanisms and what tools are best for certain types of scenarios, and where maybe we think things either are going or should be going in the future.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I guess, that I always like to kick it off here by asking you a question, just to kind of start us off. But I guess, what do we mean by transforming and curating data, and how might that, be different for different people?
I need to get you to start asking me yes or no questions. They're so
Yeah,
much easier.
right. I know. Yeah.
So let's talk about transforming and curating data and in general, what does that mean? Why do we use those terms? So if you look at the history of analytics, many years ago, data warehousing concepts were introduced, Kimball and Inman mechanisms for dimensionalizing data and allowing that data and the dimensions to change over time. ETL tools came into play. A number of big players grew out of that, to take data that comes from various sources and transform it into these structures that we are using for reporting and analytics. And what we've seen happen in the last 5 to 8 years, as more and more people are shifting their analytics processing workloads to cloud platforms, is the need and desire for heavily dimensionalized models has fallen to the wayside a little bit. Um, there are still scenarios where it makes sense, but because of the processing power that's available today and the inexpensive disk and things like that, things like having duplicated data and such um, aren't as impactful on an organization, right?
Yep.
And when I say duplicated, I mean if I have the same date in multiple rows, right?
Hmm.
Rather than dimensionalizing that out into a date table and only having it once, that's not a big deal as long as it's maintainable, right?
Hmm.
So when we talk about transforming and curating, um, transforming is really, I have data in source formats. How do I get that into a format that's usable, right? So at its basest form, I want to be able to query that data. I need to get it into some data store, into some mechanism where I can query that data and look at it and potentially visualize it with some sort of tool. Um, and there are multiple levels to this, right? We're not going to dive into data cleansing, quality management, and data governance in this conversation. But you know, you might have data coming in from one source that comes in a CSV format. You've got another source that you're going, and it's coming in as change events in real time. You've got other sources where it's coming in as JSON, other sources where you might be directly connecting to a particular service and integrating that data in yourself and feeding it in some other format. And you want to normalize it enough to be usable
Hmm.
in a reasonably both cost and performance efficient way. So that's really the transforming piece, right? How do I take this original format and put it into something a little more normalized, a little more common, to get people to use it? And as we approach it, we typically look at what's the shortest route to get there, and usually that ends up being some sort of data lake mechanism but the idea is to get it to a point where people can start using it, right?
Yep.
Now we get to the question of curation. Well, curation has some transformation in it, but curation is about taking all of that original source data and enhancing it for a purpose,
Mm-hmm.
right? So if we want to take a look um, at marketing campaigns and tie them to sales, right? You might curate a data set that takes your campaign management software, your website analytics software, takes your CRM and sales enablement software, takes your finance software, and pulls data from all those different places, either directly or from a data lake that has that data in them, and brings them together into such a way that it can be used for taking a look at campaigns and how much ROI you're getting from different campaigns. So how do you do campaign analysis, right? So that would be a curated data set, right? You might take that same data set or those same sources and curate another data set for financial analysis of the business,
Mm-hmm.
sales predictability, right? Understanding as different sales opportunities reach different stages in the process, what is the realistic probability of closure, right? So that we can start doing pipeline analysis and feed that all the way through our revenue analysis, both past and future, budgeting, all of that stuff. So curation is about how do we take data and start to mold it for a use, right? If we think about the historical world, you'd talk about things like an enterprise data warehouse, which has all your data in it. And then you talk about data marts, where you may have massaged that data for a purpose.
Yep.
The terminology we use today is transforming and curating, right? We're curating data for different purposes. And those purposes are much broader nowadays. In the past, it was I needed this so that I can create a report using, business objects or Cognos or Crystal reports, et cetera, and send it to my sales team or send it to my marketing team. Today, that's still a part of it, but now also we have things like real-time dashboards. We've got real-time dashboards that are exposed to customers and partners. We've got applications who want this information. We've got processes whereby we are building machine learning models and AI platforms that we then use operationally, both from an analytics perspective and an operations systems application perspective, right? So all of this starts to, back to that whole, uh, digital data convergence concept. All of these things support a lot of different needs. So it becomes important to understand that. So I kind of blathered on for a long time.
Yeah, no, you're good. I think another thing to that too is that there's, you'd mentioned machine learning models, and there's multiple levels of the curation too, and especially
Yes.
when you go to optimize as well, and choosing the right file formats and making sure that you have there's one thing to be able to prototype, another thing when you go to optimize at scale and do things in production. And I'm going to wait on that question for a little bit, but I want to start and just maybe kind of go down the list here of some of the AWS options. And I guess we'll start off with kind of the biggest one, and that's just the suite of AWS Glue and some of the options within it.
Right. And I think, as we dive into this, I'm going to make an observation, which is AWS has kind of taken the position of we serve builders, right?
Yep.
And as we look at these tools, what you're going to find is there's a lot of tools in this toolbox, and there's kind of a dependency on us as builders to understand them and to pick the right tools for the job and for our organization, right? Because it's not necessarily the case that all of them make sense, right? And there's a lot of overlap between what a lot of them can do. So picking the right ones, making the right bets, but having that adaptability and flexibility to shift is going to be important. So let's talk about Glue. And there's a lot of pieces of Glue that we're not going to talk about, like schemas and tables and crawlers and stuff in this. But when we look at Glue, some of the big things that we think about are the one that's been around for a long time, Glue Jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And Glue jobs basically is started out as the ability to run PySpark jobs. So
Mhm.
Python written jobs running on Apache Spark,
All
but with
powerful Spark.
yeah, the all powerful Apache Spark. But to do it without having to worry about infrastructure, right?
Yep.
In this case, you write your PySpark job. They've got the concept of developer endpoints, so you can build your job in a Jupyter notebook, test it
Mhm.
out, run it, and then deploy it, have it run. And all you really do is you provide it the job in Python, and they support Scala as well in case people care. Um,
Yep.
and you tell it how much power do you want to give it, right? They call it, I think, data processing units or something like that. But basically, it ends up converting into how big of a Spark cluster does this have to run on,
Yep.
and you don't even have to worry about anything under the hood with regard to the Spark cluster. All you have to worry about is what you've written and is it effective in leveraging Spark in the processing, right? Is it parallelizable enough?
Yeah, and that's being able to democratize to the data scientists that might not be the
Yep.
advanced data engineers, and I think that's a common theme along AWS. And I guess what are some of the other pieces of Glue that they're starting to develop, and maybe some of the pros and cons, and
Yeah.
kind of where they're at on the maturity scale as well.
So and I'm going to do speculation here as to some of the
Mhm.
whys, because the order that these kind of came out was Glue jobs with PySpark, right? Let's give you the power of Apache Spark, and try to make it really simple. All you have to do is write the stuff and put it out there. They had a very simple kind of visualization assembly tool, but all it did was template it out and generated some code that you had to go and do more
Mhm.
stuff with anyway. Then they came out with Python shell jobs as part of the Glue jobs. And what that did for you was gave you the ability to run jobs in Glue that did not require Apache Spark. Not every data set
Yep.
requires Apache Spark, and it can take time to spin those things up and get that processing going. So they came out with shell jobs, a support for that, and running those under Glue as well. Still requires you to write Python code to go and manipulate data, but it takes you another step further, simplifies some things, gets rid of some performance and cost issues. The next direction they went, at least in the Glue suite, is they introduced Glue DataBrew. So
Yep.
DataBrew is a much more visual tool for preparing and processing, transforming, curating data than the Glue jobs. It's got a very nice visual design to it. One of the things that's really cool is that it provides kind of data profiling for you.
Yeah.
So as you're playing with the data, you can play with a subset of the data. So you can say, hey, I want to grab, 500, 1,000, 25,000, items, the first N, last N, or a random selection across. And it will give you, based on that sample, information about data distributions, what are your max and min and what are your ranges. They'll actually give you little histograms on each field showing you the values that are in that field. And then within that, you've got field level operations you can do where you can create new fields, delete, hide fields, split, merge, map, do all kinds of things with it. I want to change it from this format to this format. I want to change it from a string to an integer. I want to split time and dates separately and put them in different columns. You can do all of that very simply. You can also join multiple data sets together with it.
Yep.
Um, you can then take this stuff, and they refer to these as recipes. You can put together a recipe of all of the things you want it to do, and you're just visually doing it. You can preview it right there in the UI, and then you can publish that recipe, and you can create a job. And I don't know if this is for sure or not, but they are using data frames behind the scenes. I'm going to speculate that they're running this on Spark too,
Yeah.
and not just running it, in Python and Pandas or something like that.
Yep.
Because they talk about being able to use DataBrew for handling, terabytes, petabytes of data. in the job. So I'm going to assume that they're actually producing something from this that runs on top of Spark. So it's really cool that way.
Why is it uncool though?
Why is it uncool? Yeah, cool and uncool. I don't know if these are the best terms, but that's fine.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
The things that are cool, that are uncool about it right now is it is obviously still early release, right?
Mm.
They just released it within the last couple of years, and they're, as with everything, they will continue to grow it, right? We've seen the same thing with QuickSight. When version 1 of QuickSight came out, we're like, well, this is a really cool tool, and it looks like it has some potential legs, but they've got some work to do to get it to a point where it's competing with some of the other major tools in the market. And they've done that. They've pulled that off. I think they're going to do the same thing with DataBrew.
Yep.
But they've got a limited set of output formats right now, right? They've got other tools that you can take the output formats that Brew can generate and do other things with them, but it does require some further things that you need to do. The other thing is right now it is batch, right? You schedule jobs, right? You can write Lambda code and use Lambda to trigger a dynamic on-demand run of it when like a new file arrives or something like that. But
that's another skill set though that's not geared towards the DataBrew user.
Exactly. That's another skill set. And if you're trying to try to push DataBrew out to a broader user base, now you've got a scenario where it's like, okay, but now I have to support them with some very specific skill sets. And it also is not in clear support of some of the more real-time stuff that we're seeing demand increasing for, right? So and last week we talked about Event Bridge and how Salesforce can send data on changes in. Well, it would be nice to watch that data come in, hit the data lake, and immediately update all of the dependent curations that data flows into, right? And happen in a near real time flow. But today, if you're using DataBrew or Glue jobs, things like that, you have to let that data collect for a little bit, so you have a reasonable amount of data to play with, and then you have to go and run all your jobs. So there's still that batch feel to it, which I think will either change over time or it will improve. So, for example, back to Glue jobs, another modernization that they did there was support for streaming jobs on Spark. Right? So that's a great step forward, bringing that capability into DataBrew and be able to process data that is streaming in via Event Bridge or other mechanisms and feed that and actually chain these curations together to watch the updates go through will really help, I think, in the future.
Yeah, I think there's so many different places to come in and be able to orchestrate these jobs. I think of, we did a lot of work at Charter of moving data from one S3 bucket to the next, to your point, from the structured zone to the curated zone.
Right.
And, you could do a lot of these things from Event Bridge. You can do stuff, streaming wise. I guess, what do you think is going to be that final ending place? And I guess maybe it's just going to be different for everyone, but what do you think as far as in terms of DataBrew?
So I think when we look at what's happening in the market today from a standpoint of companies' needs for data and for analysis of that data for use in applications, I see a couple of interesting things that are happening that make me feel that companies like AWS and others need to find a way to be a little less, here are great tools for you to use, and be a little more opinionated on some things as you get close to the final end user, right? Early on, if you're just talking to builders and it's like, hey, you know how to build a house, here's your hammers, here's your saws, you know how to do this stuff, right? You go look at it and figure out the best way, right? But you go to a homeowner and they're like, I have no idea how to build a house. You just gave me a whole bunch of tools. I don't know what I'm doing here. But if you give them something prefab, or you give them a pop-up camper or something like that.
Mhm.
They can put that together, but they're limited in what they can do. So finding out how do we enable those business users um, to be as functional as they can be while minimizing the back end support needed to make that happen, right? And here's why this concerns me. Couple of things are happening out there. One is we've got an increasing amount of data and an increasing competitive demand for data in decision making,
Mhm.
right? So that puts pressure on. I need to be able to get my information now, whether it's part of an app and making decisions or me making a decision. On the other side of it is we've got a bunch of people who know how to manipulate data, but I'm seeing more and more of them, their career path is shifting towards deeper data science and AI and ML,
Mhm.
right? And there is valid reason for that, but what that's doing is it's taking them out of that transform and curate world
Yep.
into a different world, which now minimizes the skill sets and the number of people available to do that work, right? So when an organization wants to scale up their use of data in analytics, they're bound in that, group of people who really know how to manipulate data. So the more we can ease people out, closer to the edge, if you will, and give them more tools and give them more opinionated tools that would basically take away some of their specific, you know, decisions they have to make on, do I use DataBrew? Do I use Glue Jobs? Do I do it in Python? Do I do it in Scala? Do I do it?
Yeah.
It's like,
I'm,
you know,
yeah, it's really getting almost ridiculous how many choices that you have to make. And
yep,
you get into the point too of, okay, thinking about different aspects to it, whether it's privacy or whether it's cost control or if it's pure optimization too.
yep,
I mean, I think there's so many levers that get pulled, and also just the size of the company too, and to
absolutely.
your point, the availability of talent and what does that look like? So
And what's interesting is I've had this conversation over the last number of years with many different organizations, and we talk about, there's a number of buzzwords out there, right? Self-service analytics, data democratization, all of these things, and when we talk things like self-service analytics, the pushback I always get is, well, the people out in the business functional areas, they really don't, they're not analytics people. They don't know how to use the tools. How would we ever make that happen? And I look at them and I say, you know what? They are analytics people.
yeah.
They're doing it today. They're using Excel. They're going out and pulling data from the finance system and from the CRM system. And they're getting people to dump reports for them that they pull into Excel. And they're manipulating the data in Excel and writing functions and transforming and
Mhm.
extracting data from other data strings. And they're building charts and graphs in Excel. So they're already doing it.
Yep.
The question is, can you take them and move them off a tool like Excel onto a tool like QuickSight and DataBrew and things like that? And are those tools ready for those users to make their lives easier? Right?
Yeah, and can it's all about data literacy and also just about the literacy around the tools as well, because they might have the data literacy within Excel, but now it's doing that knowledge transfer and that change management around the new tools.
Right.
Before we get into the more cool stuff, I wanted to talk about in older school one and within EMR and EMR serverless and maybe talk about some of those use cases. And I
Yeah.
know we're kind of the anti EMR folks around here, but I think it still needs some time.
Well, similar to conversations we've had before, like around, Lambda versus containers and stuff like. I am pro serverless, right? But there are situations where containers just make a lot more sense. Uh,
Mhm.
you know, Glue Jobs and Glue Databrew are ways of, Amazon talks about, undifferentiated heavy lifting and them taking that on, and they're very, very good at that.
Yep.
Um, Glue Jobs is an example of that. You don't have to worry about Spark. Glue Databrew is an example of that. But the difference is the further you get away, the more you abstract those things away, the less fine-grained control you have, right? If I'm running DataBrew or Glue jobs, there's only so much I can do in tuning the actual underlying infrastructure to perform a certain way, right? Before Glue streaming, I worked with one global client, and the amount of small jobs that they had to execute, and they wanted to use Spark to do it. Glue was completely just, it priced it out of the space. It was less expensive for them to take on the ownership of managing an EMR cluster so that they could inject tasks into a running existing managed Spark cluster, and they could scale that cluster up and down themselves.
Yep.
Right.
Leverage the transient workload, spot instances,
Absolutely. Absolutely. So to me, things like go Glue and Glue DataBrew all the way over to EMR and serverless EMR, it's a spectrum. And that spectrum is a trade-off between ease of use and fine-grained control. And that fine-grained control may be of cost management, maybe of availability, maybe of performance, any of those types of things, right? And for ease of use, you give up access to some of that stuff because they're abstracting that away. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. And I see more and more need for the ease of use side. But there's still going to be scenarios where you need the rest.
Yeah, it's kind of like the point of, all right, let's get this spun up quickly and try stuff out, fail fast. But then when you get to that point, and again, I'm going to save this one for a little later too, you get to that point and you have the prototype, and then you move, into a more long-term solution. And, I know Lambda is one of those tools where you can get quick, easy transformations done. When would you use Lambda, and maybe when would you move off Lambda, or when is it not a good thing? Obviously, for any long workloads over 15 minutes, but is there a point where you start at a prototype point and then you move to something else, or what does that usually look like?
Yeah, so there's a few different things there. The nice thing about Lambda, especially if you use it with tools like serverless.com, the serverless framework.
Yeah.
It's very easy to get something up and working fast, right?
Yep.
So if you want to try something out, hey, I want to try taking events off of EventBridge, feeding them into a Kinesis stream, and then consuming that Kinesis stream with Lambda. You can do all of that with serverless.com and write a small amount of code, deploy it, get it up and running really fast, right? So Lambda is really good for that. Lambda is also good when you've got a high variability of volume.
Yep.
Right. I'm updating my opportunities in Salesforce, and they are changing most of the time very heavily between, 10 a.m. and noon, because that's when all the salespeople go in and update all the records, right?
Yeah, on a Friday.
On a Friday, yeah. So they're ready for the Monday morning meeting. And so Lambda is really good at scaling really fast, right? Where I see Lambda used most in transformation and curation is really in two places. One, as a triggering mechanism, right? So I want a Glue job to start not on a schedule, but when a certain file arrives in S3, or somebody uploads a certain file via an SFTP server, right?
Yep.
Via AWS transfer family. So that's one job, right? Being able to kick off transformations and curations based on events. So you're not really doing much processing with Lambda. What you're really doing is just triggering things. You're managing some control. And in that, I will group step functions as well, right?
Yep.
Because you might kick off a state machine in step functions that does certain things, maybe uses Lambdas to move files from certain buckets to other buckets and stuff like that, but then kicks off things like Glue jobs or AWS batch jobs, or injects something into a running EMR cluster or something like that. So triggering and control is one part. The other part is record by record data transformation in a real-time or near real-time stream.
Yep.
And there's a couple of ways that are obvious there for people who've been using AWS for a while. One is Kinesis data streams,
Yeah.
right? So you may feed data into a Kinesis stream, and you can write a Lambda that will easily automatically scale up and down and consume that stream in batches. And you can size the number of records in that batch so it can all run within, it can process all the records within a particular Lambda instance runtime, and export the results out somewhere else. Write them to an S3 file, put them into a database,
Pretty much
write into
anywhere.
another stream. Pardon?
Pretty much anywhere with the
Pretty
Lambda.
much anywhere, right? And the other one that maybe lesser known is Kinesis Firehose. So Kinesis Firehose is designed to take a stream of data and write it out to a destination like S3 or Amazon Redshift. And there are some other Elasticsearch. There are other supported ones as well. But Firehose supports the ability to, as part of that flow, to invoke a Lambda to transform records. Mm-hmm. So you could have data coming into Kinesis Firehose that is being directed to a table in Amazon Redshift.
Yep.
And you can inject a Lambda right into that Firehose stream that takes every record that flows through there and converts it from one structure to another before writing it into Redshift. Yep. So very quick, more in the real time, not in the batch, because oftentimes you'll need more time for the batch.
Yep.
But in the real time world, I see a lot of Lambda use for processing records as they're flowing through things.
Yeah, and then I think with Lambda, because you have Kinesis data streams, Kinesis data analytics. I think you can maybe leverage Lambda a little bit on some of the things that you might do with Kinesis data analytics, because data analytics is not cheap. And I think that that's another interesting concept. Also, another place why you'd leverage Kinesis data Firehose as opposed to data streams, if you don't need it real time and you can get by with near real time,
yep.
There's also that price and performance, kind of that, give and take there. I guess where would you use something like Kinesis data analytics?
So, if all you're doing is looking to persist your data somewhere in a particular format so it can be looked at, right? So it can be analyzed after the fact, and that data happens to be coming in real time. Things like Kinesis data streams and Lambda and Firehose are very, very good for that, right? Comes in, all you're doing is just doing a record by record manipulation in general, right? Mm-hmm. Where Kinesis analytics really shines is when you need to react in real time, mm-hmm. not just against a record, but potentially a collection of records in the stream, right? So a classic example was a project I was on many years ago. I'm getting too old. Mm-hmm. Where we were collecting data from HVAC hardware, so an IoT situation. The data was coming in from multiple points globally. We're talking, thousands and thousands of locations with many devices at each location. And we needed to run models. Now, at this point, we weren't using ML, but we had built some statistical models mm-hmm. to identify failures, predictive failures, various issues that would require us to want to raise an alert and potentially, either remotely assess the situation or roll a truck and send a tech out to look at it and evaluate if something needed to be done. And in that scenario, a lot of our work was time window based. So a new piece of data with some temperature and humidity data and chiller, engine speed, motor speeds and temperatures comes in, and I need to look at a 24-hour window of time as soon as that comes in to see if I've seen something change in that 24-hour window that makes me say there's a potential problem, right?
Yep.
So I could just write it to a database and have something on a schedule that goes out and queries that database and looks at all of that stuff for every piece of data that I've got on a regular basis, which can be problematic because now I'm not doing it on change. I'm doing it against everything, no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
But with Kinesis Analytics, I can look at it and say, oh, I've got a new record. I'm going to go and by the way, I can keep 24 hours to 7 days of that stream in Kinesis. I can now write SQL that will basically collect and time window that information and run some analytics on it and get real-time notification that way. So it's got a set of use cases that are growing smaller and smaller as other technologies are coming out,
Yep.
but it still has a niche where it is very important,
Yeah,
especially in real-time data.
Yeah, that tech, the tech that they would send out, that'd be a shout out to my dad and brothers. They're all pipe fitters, HVAC guys. So
Yeah.
I've been trying to get them into IoT, just to open their own IoT company for years, but they like fixing it directly. So, but
Yep, absolutely.
one of those things is that you mentioned just there is that there's shrinking use cases, and it's morphing into other tools. And I think an interesting one too with streaming and also just being able to manipulate things is especially from the machine learning viewpoint is SageMaker, and some of the advances that they're making there. And I think that there's a lot of interesting transformations that you have to go through just to prepare for certain models, especially with SageMaker's, they're out of the box models. They have to be in a certain file format. They have to, the data has to be ready to be, you have to perform training in a certain format. Where at what point going back to the prototype versus production, what does that look like for a data scientist, that's preparing models or looking at models? Maybe they might spin something up in SageMaker, use the SageMaker Studio Notebook, Data Wrangler. At what point do they say, hey, maybe this should be in Glue, or maybe even some transient workloads in EMR? I guess, maybe from a change management, what does that look like?
Yeah. So as you kind of go through this transformation and curation process, when you get further and further, you become more and more specialized, right? And there are what I, like to refer to as sandbox curations as well. So when we think about model development, right? Oftentimes, when you're developing models, whether it's with SageMaker or other tools, you're looking for what data do I have access to that I could leverage to make this happen. And in a world where you're using AWS to build out data lakes and all of these different things, oftentimes data scientists will create their own sandbox curations.
Yep.
And there are many different tools they can use to do that. I mean, everything from Amazon Athena to SageMaker Data Wrangler to all kinds of things. But the question becomes, what happens when I want to make this available to everybody, right?
Yeah, that's the biggest
right?
problem,
So it's
right?
one thing to build these sandboxes, but now I've got a sandbox that represents a good training model for something. Okay. Now I could go through the process of every time, once a month, John goes and runs his Glue job that built that sandbox model, and he pulls it in and he retrains it and he republishes a model. The other option is we're taking all the tools that help you get to that nice curated model for training. How do we then push that back and operationalize that curation so that it is a curation that happens in a managed space? And now we can potentially automate model retraining and quality assurance and then publishing, right?
Mm-hmm.
and get the people out of that process. So that's kind of similar to what we were talking about earlier of, hey, it'd be really nice to have QuickSight users develop data models and data stores definitions and be able to push that back so it becomes an automated shared thing. The same thing happens in the data science world when you're, whether you're doing ML or other analyses, to be able to take the resulting curations that are important and push them back and have them become a governed, published, and managed data set.
Yeah, and I think it's also with SageMaker pipelines too. You can access Spark, Glue jobs. You can access it all from there. But you're also every time you go into that studio notebook, you're also running up the bill there too. So, being able to make that transition back, I think there's, again, that's another place where there needs to be more of an opinionated viewpoint on it, just because there's so many ways to do it. And it might be different. Maybe not the AWS sales guys and girls that are out there might not want that to be a known thing, but obviously, if you're doing the best for the customer, you need to tell them where the optimizations are. And I know that we're going to go into probably a series of shows around billing and kind of the differences in that. But I think that might be an interesting place. But
yeah, and and one thing I need to pause and do here is to give Amazon some kudos, because if you kind of step back and look at how a lot of their tools have developed, what you see is they release some tools, right? We've given you a hammer, and people are like, "Oh, that's really great. Now I have a hammer. Now I got to go find nails. Okay, I'll go find a third party I get nails from." Then Amazon said, "Hey, we've got nails now, right?
Yeah.
Great, I have hammers and nails. I'm going to go."
We use that term all the time here.
Exactly. And then you get to the point where it's like Amazon comes out and says, "Hey, here's a best practice. Use our hammer this way with these nails, and get this nail belt that you can carry the nails in, and here's a best practice that you can follow." And then they come back around after doing that cycle and learning from it, and they say, "Hey, guess what? We've got now a pneumatic nail gun with an auto feeding mechanism of nails. You just tell us what kind of nail you want."
Mm-hmm.
Right. And all you have to do is just use this nail gun now, and it gets rid of all the hammering effort and finding the nails and keeping track of the nails. Terrible analogy. but
that's you might still need the hammer just in case there's no power source at this type or this type of place too, so.
Yeah, but what will happen is we will see constant evolution of these things. But oftentimes what you'll see is first things that'll come out are best practices and different kind of architectural approaches for solving certain kinds of problems. And then they will find opportunity to take those things and build some of that into things. But again, I think that's a growth area, is as they move in, and they're learning this with things like Amazon Connect and some of the Amazon workspaces and some of the business focused solutions that they have, to how do we make it simple for non-technical people to do this kind of work, right? To manipulate data and to do analytics with that data. And how do we make it better for an organization to process and manipulate data the fewest number of times for the most number of uses? Whether it's ML, analytics, application development, integrations with third parties, whatever it might be.
Yeah, that's a good segue to my my weekly shameless Salesforce plug. Is what about looking at stuff like AppFlow or looking at SaaS products that you might be ingesting data with, and you can do different manipulation with AppFlow, or maybe you just bring it all into the data lake and do it from there. I guess
so
where's that trade-off?
Yeah, and that's a good question. I'm gonna kick that can down the road.
Yeah, because, I think there's a whole show for that. Honestly.
Yeah, today we're talking about curating and transforming, but there's a step earlier in the process, which is ingestion.
Yeah.
Right. How do we get the data into AWS? And that's where things like AppFlow and the Snow family and the Transfer family and Event Bridge and all kinds of things start to come into play in how do we both in batch and real time move that data.
You could transform on the way in, though.
You could, but and this is where we get into lineage and governance, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the positions that kind of I've taken in a lot of these things is your first job is to take your data and get it into AWS in the same format that it came out of the source system.
Yep.
Your second job is to do the minimal amount of transformation on that data that you can to make it usable and queryable, right? Not fully usable by everybody, but I can go and query it and look at the data. Yep. I've normalized date formats and things like that. Now I've got a point where I've made change, but I've not lost the original because I have that raw data that came out of the source system.
Mhm.
And then as I curate, I maintain lineage going all the way back through. So every time you curate data, there is usually data loss, right? If I take and I truncate the timestamp down to just a date,
Yeah.
I've lost now that time, right? If I extract a piece of a field and then I remove that original field out because all I needed was that piece, I've lost data, right?
Mhm.
And if you do transformation on the ingest itself, the only way you can get back to the original is you have to go to the source system.
Yep.
You have no representation of the source system necessarily in AWS, unless it's running in AWS, but it's not necessarily easy to access, right? But as a data engineer, if I have that raw file, even if it's just archived, I can always trace back to that and see what happened if I need to.
That's a great point. And what about the different ways that you can do some of these transformations? And we talked about Lambda, which Python, Scala.
Yep.
What about the AWS standard? What does that look like?
If you
The
got something specific in mind.
Well, I usually say tee it up for you, and you usually catch it there. But I was just thinking with SQL, and AWS is said they
That's
want
the one
everyone to
I
use
forget.
SQL. So
Yeah, and that's good point, and thank you for that
yeah,
reminder because
I got you
we've
back.
talked about this so many times. Yeah, we've talked about
Yeah,
this so many times, which is
yeah,
there is an increasing standardization, or maybe standardization is the wrong word, direction in using SQL as a mechanism for manipulating data beyond just a query, right?
mhm,
So we see it with, you see traditional use of SQL inside Redshift, inside Athena for querying data and selecting data. You see the standard use of SQL to be able to do things like, I want to go and create a new table with the results of a particular query, a CTES
CTAS,
query.
yeah.
And you can do that in Athena and write back to your data warehouse or data lake. You can do it in Amazon Redshift. But then you start looking at, I've got a data lake and I've got Amazon Redshift, and I need to create a new curation of data out of the data lake, and I want it in a table in Redshift. Well, I can do that by just running SQL and using Redshift Spectrum, right? Now they've introduced Particle, which allows you to do SQL against DynamoDB and other endpoints. They've released Athena Elastic Views, which allow you to now go and create views that are into multiple databases. It's a variation on database federation. But you can create a view that actually connects tables across databases and is queryable from Athena, which now, that starts to fall into both the ingestion world and the transformation and curation world, right?
Yep. But at least
But
it's in AWS, though.
right. But the other thing is a lot of people know SQL.
Yep.
And a lot more people know SQL than know Python or PySpark, to be even more specific, right? And because of that, that's another way to make more power available to people closer to the edge of usage.
hmm It's a double-edged
Is by making,
sword, though, because at the same time you're also shrinking the population that's able to do it within Python or Scala as well.
right, and that's always going to be a double-edged sword,
hmm
and there's always the question of how much are they willing to take on at the edge of consumption within an organization versus in a more centralized way, right? Yeah, there are people who say, I don't want to do that. I want them to do it for me, but that creates bottlenecks, right? And then you've got the other people who are like, I don't want them to do it for me. I can do it myself, but they don't know the right tools or the right things, and they either do things that cost money or not. So, you know, there's not a lot of clear answers here. Amazon's giving us a lot of tools, but we are on a journey right now, and we're not too far along on this journey. Come back to us in about 5 years, we might have some much more opinionated statements from Amazon and from ourselves around, all right, here's the tooling you should use and how different groups should participate together to make the most effective flow of data and analysis of data in an organization.
Absolutely. And I guess, we're coming up on time, but I guess I wanted to reach out to the audience. If you have any opinions on what to use with certain use cases, please feel free to comment, and definitely subscribe as well. And Michael.
Absolutely, absolutely. And people who are watching us live, you feel free to ask questions in future episodes. Ask them via the comments, and we'll be happy to respond to them as we go through our sessions. So it's come up on time. It's 1:30. That's all we've got for you today. Hopefully you've learned something new and gained some new knowledge you didn't have before. And if you've liked what you heard, please, follow us and subscribe to our channels, and we'll make sure you know when we're live next. Our current scheduled one is a week from today, next Monday. So join us next week at the same time for our next fun and interesting topic. Thank you all very much.